Okay, I want to talk about, I want to continue on with the history of Taoism, but I have to address something first. So, Chinese, of course, does not use the Roman alphabet, so you have to have a transliteration system for converting Chinese script to the Roman alphabet of English. And there are two different systems, at least a lot of confusion. The older system is called the Wade system. It was written by a British guy in the 19th century. There is a more modern system called the Pinyin system, which was adopted by the People's Republic of China in 1979. And you see both. It's confusing. So when I was growing up, the capital of China was called Peking under the Wade system. The Pinyin system is an effort to make the Roman alphabet version sound more like the original. And so now it's Beijing under Pinyin. And if you ask a Chinese speaker to pronounce the capital of China, they will likely say something that sounds a lot like Beijing. So it's more accurate. Same way with Tao. So it's pronounced Tao, even when it was spelled T-A-O. Pinyin system spells it with a D, D-A-O. You see both. Taoism with a D is how your reading spells it, but Taoism with a T is how the IB Guide to World Religion spells it. So both are right. Try and stick with one. Names are particularly confusing. The philosopher who is sort of the big name in Taoism is the philosopher Lao Tzu under Wade, although it's spelled this way under Pinyin, and I think it's pronounced something like Lao Tzu. His principal book, which is the principal philosophical text of Taoism, is the Tao Te Ching, spelled this way under Pinyin, Tao Te Ching, which looks more accurate. You'll see both. Just try not to get confused. And I'll try and separate the two when I talk about it. All right, continuing on with history. We talked about this shamanic period. Now I want to talk about, moving into actual historical time. About 770 BCE, the structure of the Zhou kingdom, the Zhou dynasty, was disintegrating. In the next 500 years would be a time of political chaos and civil war, divided into two areas, two time periods. The first is the spring and autumn period, 770 to 476 BCE, with feudal lords expanding their territory. The second half is called the Warring States period, 475 to 221, when the feudal states were reduced to 7 Chinese superpowers, and one of them, the Qin, would defeat the rest and end the period. This Qin warlord would unite all of China under really the first empire called the Qin dynasty. But as you see, it really wouldn't outlive his life. He's known as the first emperor. He's the guy with the terracotta warriors buried with him. But the Han would quickly pick up the pieces and rule for 400 years. All right, within these 500 years of chaos were the great philosophers, Confucius and Mencius. They were about social order and virtue. Confucius is the principal philosopher, and he was a real person. We know that. We have his writings, and Mencius was his sort of successor later, Confucianism 2.0. Mozu was about universal love and self-sacrifice, more of the love aspects of Jesus and the Buddha. By the way, notice this isn't the axial age. Sun Tzu was the military strategist. He wrote a book called The Art of War, which is still widely read as the master book of strategy. Then you have the three great Taoist philosophers, Lao Tzu, Chuang-Tzu, and Lai Tzu, each of which wrote a book. All are important. Lao Tzu, or Lao Tzu, sort of represents Taoism 1.0 of the spring and autumn period. Zhuangzi and Lides represent Taoism 2.0 of the Warring States period. This overall period is called the classical period because it's when the three Taoist classics and other classic Chinese texts were written. Now, the political and historical background of the spring and autumn period. A distinguishing feature of the period is the rise of these semi-autonomous feudal states. So you might have ruled a district or a county of the Zhou Empire, and you set yourself as a petty king. There was this feudal disintegration. 5 great noble houses emerged: the Qi, the Qin, the Sung, the Qin, Chu. So 5 warlords of the spring and autumn period. In the beginning of the period, there were 140 feudal states. In the end, only 44. So there was a demand for political and military advisors. It produced a new social class unique to the latter Zhou, mercenary statesmen and itinerant advisors who would travel around to these petty kings offering statecraft and military advice. While some just wanted fame and power, others truly wanted to build a better society, and Confucius and Laozi were two of those. All right, excuse me for that break. All right, speaking of Lao Tzu, let's talk about him in Taoism 1.0. He might have been a mythical figure. Like Buddha, we don't know for sure he existed, but we think there was some kind of antecedent. But analysis shows that the Tao Te Ching was written clearly by more than one person. And that's the consensus. And it was clearly the product of the spring and autumn period. For the Taoists of the Tao Te Ching, a sage, a ruler, or a wise man was not a social dropout. Now, that will change in Taoism 2.0 of the Warring States period. But for the Tao Te Ching Taoists, for them, the sage was an individual who understood the natural way of things, the Tao, and lived in harmony with it. Therefore, changes in society must come from changes within individuals, and changes in individuals could come only from following the principles of the Tao, the way of the universe. It is this feature that distinguished the Taoism of the Tao Te Ching from the teachings of Confucius. For Confucius, a peaceful, harmonious society was one in which people observed and followed the correct rituals and codes of interpersonal behavior. It didn't matter what the nature of the universe was. It didn't really matter what an individual was. So what are the teachings of the Tao Te Ching? The Tao is the source of life and all things. It is transcendent, therefore nameless, invisible, ungraspable by normal modes of perception. Hidden beneath the transition of change, the Tao is the permanent underlying reality. So it is the transcendent, but it is not a deity or spirit. So it is different than the shamanistic, animistic worldview. But in the Tao Te Ching, the Tao is a benevolent force, albeit not a conscious one. It also talks about sagehood. What does a sage look like? Some parts of the Tao Te Ching show strong influence in the shamanic culture of the Chu. In the parts about sagehood and cultivating life, recall that Lao Tzu was a native of Chu. He was a southern Chinese. Therefore, many scholars assert that Taoism was rooted in the culture of the South. Therefore, it was rooted in that shamanic culture we talked about. And so the sage had Yu-like shamanic abilities. He was immune to poison. He talked to animals. He had sexual energy that was strong. And the sage practiced methods to prolong life. The Taoist sage was also a very involved member of the community, and in fact, made an ideal ruler. Wu Wei, in this sense, is a source of confusion. Wu Wei had different meanings for different Taoist philosophies. The Tao Te Ching Wu Wei is different from the Wu Wei of Zhuangzi and Laozi. Wu Wei of the Tao Te Ching is going with the principles of the Tao, and the path of the Tao is benevolent. Therefore, Wu Wei in the Tao Te Ching is not doing nothing. It is not even the non-interference of Zhuangzi. The Tao Te Ching Wu Wei means not using force. So far from doing nothing, the Taoist sage of the Tao Te Ching is an active member of society and fit to be an appropriate ruler. I do want to say, while the Tao Te Ching is about Taoist philosophy and about Wu Wei, again, do not forget that it's rooted in the shamanic culture, and they're these sort of shamanic, crazy sort of powers that the sage ostensibly can cultivate. Pause for a minute. Okay, continuing on. In the Tao Te Ching, the sage is one who cultivates life by physical techniques and by attitude. What do I mean by physical techniques? Well, I mean regulation of the breath, physical postures, cultivating sexual energy. And that has to, we'll talk more about that later. That has to do with cultivating youth and vitality. What about the attitude stuff? Well, lifestyle and attitude. Tao Te Ching states that desire, attachment, and material things and activities that excite the mind, rouse the emotions, tire the body, stimulate the senses, are all detrimental to health. So in a way, the physical techniques part are similar to the Raja Yoga of Hinduism, and the lifestyle and attitude parts are similar really to Buddhism. The message of the Tao Te Ching is cultivate mental and physical qualities of the sage, get involved and help in a non-intrusive way, retire when the work is done. The philosophy of the Tao Te Ching grew out of the spring and autumn period, but it's also a product of the Chu regional culture, the shamanic culture. And shedding the shamanic spirits but retaining the personal power of the shaman, the Tao Te Ching represents a transition from shamanic beliefs to a philosophical system with a unified view of nature, of the nature of reality, the Tao, the sage, and the cultivation of life. So let's move on to the Warring States period. So the Tao Te Ching fits in the spring and autumn period. The Warring States period gives us these philosophers, Zhuangs and Lides. As the spring and autumn period drew to a close, it was down to 44 feudal states. By the year 390, this was reduced to 7 large states and 3 small ones. Territorial expansion came to a halt because it would involve major conflict between essentially superpowers. But reduction of the Zhou to a county, basically, opened the possibility of a new unified imperial state. So demand for statesmen, diplomats, and military advisors was actually greater than the spring and autumn period. Many famous philosophers emerged in this period. Mencius, Confucius' successor, and Zhuangs and Lides, the Taoist successor of Laozi. By the time of the Warring States period, many were disillusioned of all this centuries of chaos. These people they said there's no fixing government society. These people wanted no part of politics and believed that pursuit of fame and fortune was inherently opposed to cultivation of health and longevity. Laozi or Zhuangs and Lides were among these. They advocated non-involvement, regarded social conventions as the enemy of personal freedom and integrity. Increasingly, Taoists became like hippies. In these two philosophers, classical Taoism enters a new phase, and several features distinguish this phase from the philosophy of the Tao Te Ching. One, the talk of sagely rulers and ideal governments is gone. Confucian models of a benevolent ruler are mocked. Two, the sage is no longer interested in ruling or serving the state. In Tao Te Ching, the sage minimized desires, lived simply, and cultivated longevity while functioning as the head of a state. In the Warring States period, Zhuangs and Lides believed political involvement and longevity were incompatible. The meaning of Wu Wei changed to non-involvement or letting things be. The sage was no longer involved or concerned with matters of the world. Third, Warring States Taoism saw an alteration in the meaning of the Tao. In the Tao Te Ching, the Tao was not a deity, but it was benevolent. It was a benevolent force. Zhuangs and Lides saw the Tao as a neutral force. So despite these changes, Taoism of the two periods had much in common. The individual was understood. The nature of the Tao was an enlightened being or a sage. In the Tao Te Ching, the Tao was the origin of all things. This was developed further in the Warring States period to mean that all things had equal standing in the universe, which they refer to the principle of equality of all things. In all of classical Taoism, the sage is unmistakably shamanic. Zhuangs and Lides, however, reject institutional, superficial forms of shamanism as sorcery and charlatanism. Zhuangs and Lides we continue to see emphasis on caring for the body. Like the Tao Te Ching Taoist, Warring States Taoist advocated simple lifestyle, minimal desire, avoiding excitement, satisfying the senses, but additionally, they condemned social cultural norms. By the end of the Warring States period, classical Taoism became a voice against hypocrisy. Since society was corrupt, it was best to stay out. The hermit or recluse alternative lifestyle emerged. Later, this would be adopted by the greatest artists and poets of China. Hermits became the symbol of integrity and personal freedom. We have, of this period, there's a group called classic Taoist sages called the Seven Sages of the Bamboo Grove. This is one of them. He's got a liquor bowl up here. He's kind of fat. He's a hedonist. He's got his hands in the air like he don't care. This is the sage of Taoism 2.0. Therefore, classical Taoism 1.0 advocated reform with hope of building a better society, but during the Warring States period, Taoism 2.0 began to take a negative view of politics, culture, and social rules, and simultaneously increased emphasis on individual freedom and the cultivation of life. By the late Han, its distrust of establishment like politics, society, culture was complete. However, whether it was optimistic, pessimistic, idealistic, disillusioned, active, or escapist, Taoism was always a voice that spoke for the preservation of the natural way of the Tao. And that is how all of the Taoist philosophy is united.